My story begins the way a lot of my stories begin. This was told to me by my grandfather, and it was about his grandfather. His grandfather was a fisherman who worked the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland. He served upon a ship called the Mary Ellis. Now, it was bitter cold on the night before Christmas, just south of the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland, a wild, melancholy, uneasy part of the Atlantic Ocean. The cold spray would come over the bow like a discharge of shot made of ice. Now the skipper of the Mary Ellis was a rough, mean man, and he was trying to save oil, so his side lights were not burning. But there was always a watch posted. Not sure how the watch missed what was to happen next. Maybe it was because the cold spray was in his eyes, or because it was darker than the inside of a cuttlefish. But all of a sudden, there was a scream. "Steamer!" Followed by a crash, the jarring sound of rending wood, and the ship veered off course. Everyone was thrown about. Running up on deck, out of the darkness, the men of the Mary Ellis could make out a huge steamship. The ship must have been gunning for the transatlantic record with the pace they were pulling. Luckily, it hit the Mary Ellis with a glancing blow to the port quarter, carrying away a part of her bulwarks. It could have just as easily cut the ship in half. Quick as can be, the captain orders the men, "Put the rowboats in the water. Find and retrieve the bulwarks." The Atlantic likes to play with the boats in the darkness, between the swells of the waves. Even with the running light lit now, the ship would sometimes disappear when you were in between the swells of some of the larger waves. Using lanterns, the men of the Ellis located the missing part of their ship, but it seems that it had picked up some additional cargo. "Why, it's a little girl."
"She's unconscious."
"Where do you think she came from?"
"She must have fallen off the steamer when they hit our ship."
"She has a soggy name tag on her. Says her name is Molly." They brought their new cargo back to the Mary Ellis as quickly as possible. The captain and the men looked down puzzled. "A kid? Take her forward, some of you, and see her looked after." And after having made sure that his ship was not seriously injured, he returned to his cabin to sleep.
"We need to thaw her out."
The sailors fell into a general discussion as to how Molly should be treated, for the poor little thing was quite unconscious, and her clothes were frozen on her. However, after a while she was undressed and properly and gently thawed out and put to bed. One of the sailors mixed a warm drink and poured it between her teeth. She gave a little gasp, opened her eyes, and gazed around.
"Oh, there isn't any Christmas tree after all."
And with that, she fainted away again. The sailors looked at one another in solemn silence, till one finally said, "Well, if she ain't a-hunting for trees on the southerly end of the Grand Banks, well, that's what she's a-looking for, and that's what she's gonna fur to get," said Handsome, slapping one huge fist into the other, and then he and the other seamen sat down and conversed earnestly in low tones. "We must get to work right away." While the rough sailors were at work, the little girl passed from a state of unconsciousness to one of sleep. The big seamen took turns in watching over her. It was not a pretty bedroom that Molly had that night. It was dark and dingy, and full of weird noises of groaning timbers. A swinging lantern threw changeful shadows into all the corners, and showed some very rude bunks in which several sailors off watch were trying to snatch a brief rest. Just behind those bunks, against the stout sides of the ship, the seas burst in booming shocks, and ever and anon there was a noise of falling water overhead. Up and away, the bows would soar and then plunge down again with sickening rush into the turmoil of foam. But of course, the sailors thought nothing of all these things. The forecastle was their home, and they were long ago hardened to its sights and sounds. In spite of everything, the little girl slept quite soundly, wrapped in a rough blanket and with a pea jacket spread over her shoulders, while Handsome and the other sailors were at work with a boat hook, some small pieces of wood, oakum, and green paint. Whatever it was they were making, it was strange enough to look at. but their hearts were in their work, and they conversed earnestly in low tones. At last it was finished, and set up in a bucket close against the bulkhead, where the lantern shed its fitful light full upon it. And then those sailor men went rummaging in their chests, as they had been voyagers in all parts of the globe. They brought forth some curious toys to put upon the wondrous Christmas tree which they had made. Handsome contributed shells from the Indian Ocean, a dried mermaid, and a small Hindu god which answered very well for a dolly. Another produced a South African dagger. There were also Chinese puzzles, brass nose rings, a tintype, a string of coral, and a beautiful India silk handkerchief. The gifts were unusual, but they were gifts all the same. Handsome gravely hung them on the Christmas tree. When all was done, he stepped back and studied the effect. Yes, you couldn't get any such a tree anywhere. Just then, the little girl awoke.
Why, it's a Christmas tree.
The sailors nudged one another.
Isn't that a Christmas tree?
That's what it is. And we's is also Santa Clauses.
What funny Santa Clauses. I always thought there was only one.
Well, aboard this here bark there is several.
Oh, what funny things I got for my Christmas. I never got so much before. But I think I'd rather have my father and mother, please.
Don't go for to cry. I'll sing you a song.
Oh, you are a nice Santa Claus.
All the rest of you Santa Clauses join in the chorus, said Handsome, standing up and taking a hitch at his trousers. Then he sang.
Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, o'er the fields we go, laughing all the way. Bells on bobtails ring, making spirits bright. What fun it is to ride and sing a sleighing song tonight. Oh, jingle bells, jingle bells.
Now the captain, who had come on deck and heard this racket, ran to the forecastle hatch to see what was going on. He dropped down among his men so suddenly that they all paused in silence, expecting an outbreak of anger. But the captain slowly realized the meaning of the scene upon which he had intruded, and said, "All right, lads, amuse her, and take good care of her. And when we get to New York, I'll make it my business to find her father." He was as good as his word, and in due time Molly was placed in the arms of her parents, who had been mourning her as dead. It was a joyous reunion, you may be sure. My grandfather would never forget that strange Christmas Eve at sea and the wonderful Christmas tree they made for Molly Ryan.